Everyday Business Solutions, the podcast that offers you the right perspective on achieving success. We interview business professionals from all over to bring our listeners the right solutions to all their questions. Season 1 is about change management and enabling you to both face and create change in all aspects of your company. We're talking management, sales, service, HR, and more. Let's jump straight into the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Everyday Business Solutions. My name is Haley Morris. I'm your podcast coordinator and host. And with me today, I have Dave Bahr. And so, Dave, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself so that we can get into the topic for today's episode.
Hi there, everybody. I am Dave Bahr. I own a company called In-Sightful Living, and I am totally blind, and I have been since birth. And I work in the disability advocacy and accessibility space for technology and helping people with and without disabilities to, well, live insightful lives, if you will, and to try and bridge this gap that seems to be omnipresent between accessibility and products and technology. And I wanted to talk about where we go and how I work as a person who, this is my life. This is what I do on a daily basis for being a blind person, how I navigate a computer and my phone and everything. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. I'm super excited to have you on. I've worked in environments where we have accommodated some physical disabilities and some other things, but personally, I don't have as many limitations, and it's such a huge thing when you are literally missing part of the population if you're not bridging that gap. And so I'm excited to have you on that you can actually speak from that perspective. And you've worked in this area too, because you test as an end user, correct? Yeah. So the reason we have decided to breach this topic today is because we live in 2020. We live in the 21st century. And even though it's been a crazy year, the one thing that is becoming more abundant is our ability to reach out and connect to people across the globe. And as eager as we are to do that, there is a way to do that in which you're reaching more people, you're reaching everyone. So I want to make sure from my perspective that I am able to connect to people. And in our case, working from a marketing team, being able to connect on our websites and other platforms. And so I'm completely in the dark about what that looks like. So working with someone like Dave is going to help us kind of start to peel back the curtains and understand his point of view, and then how we can make our websites and our other platforms better and more accessible. And so, can you tell us a little more about your history and how you actually got into working in the particular field you do with accommodation?
Yeah, so I was born totally blind. I was born 3 months premature. My retinas were detached. I went to mainstream public schools. I live in Louisville, Colorado. And I went to the University of Denver and then the University of Colorado Boulder. I met the woman who became my wife in 2011. We were married from 2014 until 2017. She had brittle bones and was in a wheelchair. And I credit her to really bringing me back on the kind of the path of disability advocacy and accessibility. She unfortunately passed away of a brain aneurysm in 17. And but we every day our mission was to work in accessibility space. My space was screen reader usage. So my phone talks to me, my computer talks to me. Think of your smart speaker, except like 300 miles an hour. I listen to speech that's about 350 words a minute. And I've always listened to screen readers for 25 years or so. I read Braille. And being with Priscilla allowed me to, work in the wheelchair space and advocate for each other. I was her arms and legs and strength. She had brittle bones, and she was my eyes. And so it just sort of became a progression. And after she passed away, I wrote a book. And then I went into really working on accessibility um, from, as I said earlier, the end user perspective. And by that, um, I mean the perspective of the person who's going to sit down and look at the site and see what's going on. For the record, I use the same words as a sighted person does, even though I've never seen. So I will say, can I go see this? Can I look at this? Because it just seems kind of strange to, say goodbye to somebody and be like, well, I hear you later. You just don't do that. So I started focusing on, what do I do every day? Well, I deal with websites and apps on a daily basis that some are great, some are not, but I don't have a choice. Um, much as somebody who doesn't have a choice in a wheelchair can't go up a set of stairs. And if there's no other way up, there's no other way up, you know. Um, and so that's the very brief history.
Thank you for sharing that. I know you and I talked, I think, briefly about your wife when we talked a couple months ago, but um, she sounds incredible. So thank you for sharing that again. And um, I wanted to dive into this because I think, as well, like you mentioned, apps. For example, if you have a phone, it's all apps. And if
Right.
you have anything that we do, I think as somebody who is a seeing person, it's something I take for granted. But everything I do in my everyday life interacts with a computer or my phone to some degree. And to think of some of those apps that I'm using on a regular basis, they might not even be functional for you. Um, is something that we want to kind of strip away. We want to stop just creating things without actually looking at all aspects of that end user interface. So I think for me, the question that I wanted to kind of get into before we go too far is some common apps that I think we use, maybe like some of the social media ones and things like that. Could you give us some examples of maybe some ones that are good at using that good with their end interface? I can't speak. Are good with the end user interface, and then some that are not.
Yeah, I'll give you kind of a couple of hybrids. You may have heard of this thing called Facebook. It's seemingly ubiquitous. And they've gotten better at trying to give alternative text descriptions of what people's pictures are, except they're not very helpful because they'll say things. My screen reader will come back with a thing that says, image may contain person standing outdoor and sky. Okay. So I try and like, this is a kind of a branch, but I'll relate this back to it in a second. So I try and tell people to like put a description of like the picture shows Haley standing in a field or something, so I know what it is, because the computer algorithm doesn't always target everything. They've gotten better. Um, an interesting one that I say is kind of a hybrid is LinkedIn, and as for the past couple of months now, for the most part, LinkedIn is really accessible on the mobile phone. I have an iPhone, except I can't write a post. It brings up a text field that I start typing in, and then a pop-up comes up that says add a photo, share something, do this, do that, do the other thing, and I can't get back to the text field.
Hmm.
And I thought that they had fixed this, but I was just going to write a post before we started this podcast, and I still can't do it. Um, So even, Microsoft has made huge strides in their accessibility over the past 20 some years. Uh, Yet I can't write a post. I can read notifications. I can read messages. I can respond to messages. Um, but it's the little things sometimes that you're like, whoa, wait a second. Here's a company that has their own accessibility department. I don't have Instagram because it's all photos. Google apps are pretty accessible. I use my phone for about 99% of the things I do for work and personal. I have a laptop and I use a screen reader called NVDA, Non-Visual Desktop Access, which is free. Um, and but I find myself on the phone more and more with an external keyboard. Um, but I have kind of become, for a while there, I was testing a lot of productivity apps, time management apps, just because I enjoy it. I like to be the person that sits and looks and gets down in the weeds, as it were, of the app. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think that helps a lot from, this perspective, kind of visualizing or being able to like walk through in my mind what it's like to just interact with some of these apps that have become commonplace. And Facebook is a huge one and a great example because I know like everybody in my family is on it and a lot of people have been on it or are on it now.
Hmm.
So and I think that's how you and I met is actually through Facebook.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it
it's
was. And there's there are there are guidelines, and I'll talk about this. There's what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, WCAG. They're up to version, I think, 2.1, and it's a whole sprawling website of how to make something more accessible to not just people with screen readers, but people who have low vision. So I'm totally blind. I have been since birth. I haven't ever seen color or
mm,
shadows, but other people might be able to see color contrast or things of that nature, which I can't advise on. And so there's a whole, it's massive. And there's a whole big organization and standards of this is what really needs to be done. So a lot of the people are trying to work to fill in those guidelines, and those guidelines are great, but they're only guidelines. Um, and there have been small things, like I said, with LinkedIn, and DoorDash has done a couple of things with their app that, and everything changes. It's an ecosystem that changes on a second by second basis, it seems. And there are little things, and that's why I love doing what I do, because I'm not an HTML, Java, CSS type person. I never learned it because it doesn't really hold my interest. I'd rather be the one that pushes buttons. I was the kid that, what's this button do? What's this button do? Oh, what's this do? Drove my parents nuts, let me tell you. Um, they still bring it up. And you know, some people might say, well, oh, then you don't really know accessibility if you don't know all the guidelines. I don't know all the guidelines, but I know a lot of them. And I can tell you, what works and what doesn't. I couldn't sit there in line 5605 of the code and say that this needs to be changed to that to make the other thing work, if that makes sense.
mhm.
But I think there needs to be more end user testing early and often, has kind of always been my mantra. Because who's going to be the one using your app? It's not going to be your dev team, right? It's going to be the people that want to work at your financial institution or bank at your financial institution or use your social media platform. And so there are more studies now that are going out about the accessibility of things like Facebook and Google and things of that nature.
It's interesting just because for me, it seems like the obvious thing would be making sure that you're doing the end user testing a lot, because that's, I think, what we do with a lot of other things. If you're building a car, you're always testing to making sure it's doing what you're setting out to have it do. And so a website or something else like an app that you're interacting with, if the purpose is to make it accessible to people and you're not actually testing that accessibility with the person who would end up using the app, seems like you're missing the point. So,
I agree. The flip side of that is that there are a number of automated accessibility tools out there that are good, but can only catch the what I call the low hanging fruit of accessibility. Um, there's a company called Axe that's out there, and they do automated and manual accessibility testing with various tools and reporting um, schema. But it still doesn't replace the person that knows a screen reader and works with it on a daily basis. And
yeah.
I think that would be my most important stressing point would be ask the person that's, when you build a house, and people don't do this. If you build a house, it would be great if the people that were building the house were in wheelchairs for a day or two to show them what a person in a wheelchair might go through. My wife was 34 inches tall. What she went through in a wheelchair is different than somebody who is average size would go through in a wheelchair. I am totally blind from birth. My experience is going to be different from somebody who lost their vision in an accident or was in the military. But it's important to ask that person at the end. They're called end users, but that end is the important part.
It's what you're working towards. And the wheelchair thing, it hits my grandpa's now in a wheelchair and he wasn't for most of his life, but he got sick probably about a year or two ago. I think it might be 2 years now. And he's been wheelchair bound pretty much the entire time since there. Well, my grandma has to push him up it, and she's in her 70s, and he's almost in his 70s. And so, her pushing a fully grown man up that ramp, it looks good in principle, but she almost threw out her back the other day just trying to get him onto the ramp because there's not a piece at the end to make the transition from ground to ramp smooth. And the incline's just a smidge steep to make it easy and accessible for both of them. So to
Go look
think
up, go find a threshold, what's called a threshold ramp.
threshold ramp. I'll have to look at that.
It's a small, well, we had a couple for Priscilla, but it's a small piece of metal or plastic that does just what you're talking about. It slopes upward. I don't know if you can see my hand, but instead of this, it slopes up just enough to get that chair up onto that flat surface.
Perfect. I'm gonna have to look into that because that will make a difference for them. But
And they're
yeah,
like, I don't know, $100 or something, maybe less, maybe a little more. It depends, but yeah, exactly. And it's the little things that you don't think about
exactly.
and that I
Yeah.
don't think about even. Sometimes I'm just like, this damn thing won't work. And I scream and yell and, kick the computer and it just stares back at me and goes, yeah, so still not going to work for you.
And that's kind of the point of that end user testage though too, is it's not just a one and done type thing. Like you don't wait until you get to the end of the process and then you test, and you don't wait until or you don't do it right away and then make adjustments and never do it again. Like LinkedIn probably made some tweak along the line and now it's one little thing, but you actually can't make a post anymore.
Yeah. And I didn't have this problem until a couple months ago. And I reported, oh, it looks like they fixed it. And then I had to write back, oh, no, they haven't. And they still haven't. And sometimes I feel like I'm the small fish in the big ocean. I don't know why. And maybe that's
Mhm.
me. Maybe I need to be the big shark. in the small tank or whatever, but whatever aquatic metaphor you want to use. But I think that the idea of if you're starting a product and someone says, you know, you should make it accessible. Okay, that's great. Yes, you should. How to do it? Well, work with those web content guidelines, but also, like I said, have somebody like myself sit down and, you know, hey, can you walk us through how you would use our product? Okay. Oh, I can't do this. Oh, I can't do that. Or, oh, hey, this works great. That's another thing, if I may. I just want to point out that there's a lot of talk, and maybe we talked about this before. There's a lot of talk about inaccessibility, but I also want to point out that there needs to be talk about things that are accessible, because things have, you know, in the 20 some years that I've been using computers and screen readers have changed, and they're changing on a daily basis. I want to acknowledge that it's not this doom and gloom. Oh my God, it's all inaccessible and it's horrible. No, far from it. I just, people need to just be more aware of it. And that's, you know, that's what I do as an advocate and a coach and a speaker and an accessibility consultant. Um, but I think that I'm not, if I were to give you a report that says, this is your website, I'm not going to look at your website and be like, these are all the things that are wrong with it. There's nothing that's right with it. It's going to be a mixture of, you know, unless I absolutely cannot read it, like if it's a scanned PDF or something, which I can't read, therefore I can't do anything with, uh, I'm going to give you feedback that says, this is great, this works fine, this does not work fine, you know, let's see what we can do to tweak it. And I think going kind of along with that, um, it's not always a huge, it doesn't always have to be a huge overhaul if you know that you need to start out with accessibility and what's called universal design. Universal design started out in architecture because people said, hey, we need to design this so that anybody can get in and use this. If you're in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act was pushed for that sort of thing so that other people can use it. The ADA is great. I wouldn't be in the condo that I'm in without it. I wouldn't have gotten the education without it. However, it's just part of it. And the language is vague enough, and it's been updated. Sometimes it's antiquated and still vague enough to cause consternation and problems. But I want to just acknowledge that there's this balance between that it's not all just, oh, everything's inaccessible or everything's accessible. There's always bits of both, like we were saying with LinkedIn. So sorry, that was kind of digressive, and I get excited about these sorts of things.
Yeah, no, it's a good point though to make, to not be wholly negative, and when there's something good that comes along or when there are things that are working, to acknowledge those so you can work with keeping them where they're at or build off of what you're already doing that's working. That it sets a standard and a precedence for where you want to
Right,
get everything else to. Uh,
exactly.
so as far as somebody who wants to, wherever they may be, whether they're starting a process and they're starting with that right mindset of making it I can't speak, universally accessible. See, I can't speak. Making it universally accessible.
You can just say making it accessible.
Yeah. Um, whether they're starting out with the right mindset to do that, or they're already got the existing website and the existing processes, but they want to start moving towards that accessibility. What are some resources and some sites that they should look at first to help them get started?
So, like I said, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, I think they're up to 2.1 now, are kind of the gold standard of accessibility for websites and apps and mobile friendly. Um, there's a site called webaim.org, which has a lot of great examples for making content accessible, showing captions showing video content, um, good and bad examples. Um, you can use tools like the Axe automated accessibility checker. Um, I just, as I've kind of stated throughout this whole conversation, don't rely solely on them, because you need people to test them, such as myself, in the end. But those are the big ones.
Mm. And then, because you are one of those end user testers, what kind of things are you actually testing? Like, what kind of sites and apps do you typically test today?
So I work with mainly two screen readers for PC. I use one called JAWS, which is Job Access with Speech. It's one of the oldest and most well-known in the United States screen reader. On the PC, there's another one that I also use called Non-Visual Desktop Access, which is free and open source. And then I use VoiceOver, which is on my iPhone. I'm not an Android user. I've never learned Android. Um, there are people like, can you do all of these things? And I can like, well, I can do some of them. But that's like trying to learn, 5 different languages. And I generally test, so I'll test in Chrome and Firefox and um, in Safari on the phone, or if it's a native, mobile app, we'll just test that way.
All right, thank you. I was curious because for those who are doing that, they're going to be checking these sources, and they're going to also be working with somebody like you, or they're working with you to make sure that as they go throughout this process, they're actually reaching their goal of making it accessible. So, and then how early do you, if you're working with somebody who's starting off, how early do you typically come into the process? Do you come in when the website or the app is finished, or do you typically come in when it's still in development?
I would love to come in when it's still in development. Um, Kind of like when you're when you're building a building, it's just like building to a certain code. Uh, if you don't have that code met, you're gonna need a lot more help, and it's gonna cost a lot more money, and you're not gonna get near the market share that you want if your site or app is not accessible beforehand. It sounds very simple. If you make your website or your app more accessible, more people, such as myself, are going to use it, and that amounts to about 20% of the population, or 1 in 5 people in the U.S. have some sort of disability. Might not be blindness, but 1 in 5 means you get 5 people in a room. One of them has some sort of cognitive, mental, physical disability. That's important. And starting out and saying, all right, if I put these things in place, I'm going to have to make tweaks, but it's going to be baked in before the project really gets off the ground. Because if you don't, then you're stuck going and retrofitting everything, just like retrofitting an old building for something like a wheelchair ramp.
Yeah, it's not a fun thing to put a wheelchair
No,
ramp into something that wasn't built to have it.
right. And
So
and it's not cheap.
no. I know one thing too, my grandma and grandpa, the same one I mentioned before, is now they're actually getting their house fixed up, which I'm eternally grateful for, but making sure that the floors are all smooth and everything to accommodate his wheelchair. And now they have somebody who's working with them to, the doorways are wide enough, the floors are smooth enough, but those kinds of things cost so much more money, and sometimes like widening a door frame or putting in a bigger door than what you started with, that's a huge change, where like it's the same with a website or something. To make a large change, it's going to take a lot more shuffling and structural change sometimes than if you actually start off with it.
Right, exactly. We in my book, which is Prave, The Adventures of the Blind and the Brittle. There's a whole chapter devoted to when we bought this. We ended up buying this condo, but a couple of the things that we the homes that we ended up looking at included one that was just being built, and ones that we thought we could retrofit and make the doors and stuff wider for a power chair. And we ended up on this one, as I explained in the book. But yeah, it was a whole legal process. It was a whole process of what can the law do and what they can't do. And then, finding the place that we did, which has all wood floors, so that Priscilla's chair wouldn't get stuck on the carpet all the time, was a big help. And if we hadn't found the place, we would have, whatever place we did find, we would have probably taken out the carpet, which is not easy to do. It looks easy when you're watching people rip it out, but it's not easy to tear out carpet.
Oh, and then you hope you have good floor underneath, and usually something's wrong with the floor underneath, and you have to, yeah, it's not an easy process when you have to make those larger changes.
Right. And it's I want to just speak real quickly to the idea that disability is more often, acquired than congenital. Mine happens to be congenital. So I understand, let's just bring it back to websites and apps. I understand that it's a lot easier for somebody to drag and drop something in a Squarespace or a Wix, but just know that those aren't really accessible, and you're not going to get the clientele that you could be getting, aka the money you could be getting for your product, if something like that is used. From what I have seen of those two particular platforms, they're not really accessible, and there are different WordPress themes that are not accessible and architectures that aren't accessible. So what I was sort of getting at is that I know that it's easy sometimes to just drop things in and think, oh, well, if that person that has a disability finds my site, then they'll say something. But then you're going to have to go back and realize that you need to change things.
And then what if they don't say something? What if they just move on and decide you're not worth their time?
And I do, because I have time too. I have a life. There are plenty of there are plenty of sites out there that that I don't look at, that I look at with my screen reader once and go, no, I'm not going to use that site.
Mhm. You're not their employee. You're not someone they work with. Sorry, my voice has got scratchy. You're not someone they work with. You don't owe it to them to be like, this doesn't work for me. You know, they have
And
to.
yeah, and there is that. And I think, as somebody who makes a living doing this sort of thing, I will say, if I may be a little negative for a moment, it is frustrating that people simply expect that I just say, oh, well, this doesn't work and this doesn't work and this doesn't work. And they just go, oh, okay, thanks. And either they do something or they don't do something with it. Now, it's one thing if it's an app store review, but it's a whole other thing if they say, what doesn't work? Well, I'd like to get paid for telling you what does or doesn't work. You know, you don't go up to the chef and say, hey, thanks for the slice of beef. Can you make it into a steak? And just expect it to be given to you. That was
Exactly.
a bad analogy, but do you see what I'm getting at though?
Yeah, it's too. I think if somebody comes in and they expect you to be like, well, this doesn't work, and then be able to tell them exactly why and essentially fix it for them,
Right.
then they're asking two jobs of you.
Exactly.
So, but
And I
it's
know, I know people that do more coding than I do, and I can refer to those people. But even those people, the ones I'm thinking of in my case, are sighted and have never had the experience that I have of screen reader usage. But we play off of each other, and it's knowing who your allies and your team members are. But I've noticed a lot of people when I've said, "Oh, I do accessibility consulting," and they say, "Great, can you look at my site?" And then I give them a price, and they're like, "I'm like, well, did you expect a free lunch?"
yeah, it's not. It's like any other process that you do for your company to enhance it. If you're asking for somebody to come in, consult with you, work with you, basically do an audit, then you're not going to expect them to do it for free. I mean,
Yeah,
that's time and
you
energy.
would think.
Yeah. So it's very, thinking about that, it's kind of sad that we have to shift that mindset as well and start realizing that this is something you should be doing. It is going to cost money, and that's part of the process, like anything else that you would do to make your business better, to reach a larger demographic. Um, so,
Exactly. And once you reach that larger demographic, because people, if I work on, your website and I recommend your website and your company to people, you're going to get more money from other blind people because I say to them, hey, this site's accessible. Um, and, there are people that make their living by threatening lawsuits. And I don't think that's always the way to go about it. And maybe this is a whole topic for another conversation, but just suing somebody and saying it's not accessible doesn't solve anything.
mhm.
You know, uh, it might bring somebody to, bring awareness to that fact, but there are far less costly ways of going about it. And the reason I bring that up is just because if you start in the beginning with accessibility, you're not going to have to deal with people that make their living, feeding off of you because of inaccessibility and lawsuits. And it happens a lot. It makes me sad. But I try not to be sad about it because I want to be the person that helps people to make their sites work. And often I think I also want to point out, like I said, it's not just, it doesn't always have to be a big thing to make a site accessible. Maybe there's just something that I see that could be changed that fixes a whole thing. Or there's a company that I suggest you don't go with that all of a sudden by switching themes or plugins or something, the site works great. So
Yeah, it could be, and I don't do any sort of coding or software development or anything. I sit beside them in our back offices, but there's been no osmosis of information there. So I can't say for sure, but sometimes it might just be that little thing that needs nudged into a different spot or needs switched out, and it might make a world of a difference for somebody like you who uses a sight reader,
screen reader.
screen reader. All right. Well, I think this is a good place to begin wrapping up. I did want to ask you, do you have any advice for a business who maybe has been operating for several years and hasn't done their due diligence when it comes to accessibility, and where they should start first?
Reach out to me, actually, because I love sitting through and looking at a site and someone saying, can you do X, Y, and Z and test it and let us know how this works? Um, and, maybe it's more accessible than you think. Um, maybe it's less accessible than you think, but don't be afraid. There's so much fear and so much uncertainty that we're all guilty of, yours truly included, um, that it never hurts to just reach out and say, I have this site that I built and I have no clue if it's accessible. Okay, well, let me take a look at it. Let's talk and I'll give you a quote.
Thank you. I think that's a great starting point, and it peels back the curtain and makes things a little less like confusing. Now you can
Yeah,
tell
right.
a little more of what's going on, and it'll give you a clear idea of where to start.
Right. And if I don't know, I can find somebody who does, or help with resources. I mean, there are so many ways in this day and age of global communication that people can get so much more done. They just have to ask. And I'm guilty as charged. I will freely admit it. I do a coaching program and I want to start getting clients for that again because I've sort of let that slack. And I know that I need to work on enrollment because it's all about selling. Really, what are we doing? We're selling. Every one of us, and whatever we're doing, we are selling something or enrolling or however you want to say it. So my sell would be to enroll you out there in the land of accessibility and understanding and advocacy, and that it all can be done if you're willing to work with me.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. I want to thank you for coming on and joining us, Dave. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to another episode of Everyday Business Solutions. This is our last episode for the season. We're going to be jumping into our mini season, which will have short and bite sized episodes. And you're going to go ahead and find those the same posting time every Tuesday morning. So thank you, Dave. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
And have a good rest of your day.